It's difficult to miss Herrenberg. Even from a distance, it's dominated by a massive church rising dramatically over the town like a mother hen with her chicks. But that it still stands at all is thanks to a 10-year programme of renovation to stop it from falling apart entirely, at least for the time being. But the story begins further up the hill, where the Counts Palatine of Tübingen built a castle in the late 12th century, a strategic place with uninterrupted views across the Neckar-Gäu plateau to the Swabian Jura hills. Unfortunately, the geology is less than perfect, soft marlstone and gypsum with a covering of sandstone. The castle quickly became unstable. One tower had to be demolished, and by the middle of the 17th century nobody wanted to live there at all. The Duke of Württemberg, who by this time owned it, instead lodged in the Reeves residence. An earthquake in 1733 caused the entire castle to sink half a metre, sending a landslide into the marketplace, and in 1807 it was finally demolished. The cellar still remains, now a restaurant, and a viewing platform was built on the site of the castle's powder tower, below which was the dungeon. Near the foot of the hill is the Collegiate Church with its distinctive west tower. A church on this spot is first mentioned in 1275, but, as is quite common with any large historic building, was constantly altered and added to. By the end of the 15th century it was pretty much complete, Württemberg's first Gothic hall church. But the west front looked quite different, with two spires. By 1749 they had fallen into disrepair after being struck by lightning and were removed to be replaced with the now familiar Baroque onion dome. But like the castle, the church was built on soft ground. Not only that, but it's on the move. The entire hill is advancing towards the town at the rate of 1 millimetre a year. That may not sound like much, but in geological terms, it's frighteningly fast. The effects can be seen inside. The pillars are not quite straight, and one of them is visibly twisted. By the 1960s, things had got so bad that the building threatened to collapse, and one service was interrupted by falling masonry. In 1971 it was closed and extensive renovation work commenced which would last until 1982. Among other things, the vaulting in the westwork had to be removed and replaced by reinforced concrete ceilings. This has stabilised the church for now, but it's reckoned that more work will have to be done every 2 or 3 generations. This was, though, an opportunity to return the church interior to something more like its 15th century appearance, with the 19th century galleries removed and the dark paintwork replaced with a lighter colour. In 1513, Provost Johannes Rebmann commissioned new stalls, stained glass windows and an altar for the choir. All of these became casualties of the Reformation. Just over 20 years later, the windows were destroyed, the stalls and altar dismantled and placed into storage. Then, another 10 years later, Spanish troops stationed in Herrenberg demanded the return of the stalls and altar. The stalls are still here, although it's not certain they were reassembled correctly. In 1817, they were even painted white, only to have the paint removed 70 years later. In 1890, new stained glass windows were installed, but the altar was sold to the Royal Collection of Antiquities of the Fatherland. A miniature reproduction is now on display in the church. For Herrenberg's official 700th anniversary in 1929, the original was on loan from the State Gallery in Stuttgart, where it can still be seen. A photo taken at the time shows the sheer scale of it. One of the reasons it was sold in the first place was because it would have obscured the new window. Among the epitaphs adorning the walls is a particularly striking one commemorating Hans Jakob Kernle, a merchant who died in 1675, the patriarch of one of the town's most influential families. The church is also home to the Museum of Bells, which opened in 1990 and attracts 6,000 or 7,000 visitors a year. The main part of the museum is in the belfry, where you can actually experience the bells in operation. Shortly before the hour, a small bell outside is rung. Then come the chimes. For this, the bells are struck rather than swung. Next, the hour is struck. This is the sound of Gloriosa, the largest bell in operation here, weighing 3.6 tons. The museum contains bells spanning 11 centuries. 36 of them are in use, 2.5 octaves in total, the largest such collection in Germany, if not Europe, and that's not counting the 50-bell carillon. At certain times of the day, the carillon then plays a tune. This is followed by a liturgical bell. This is the 15th century midday bell, which calls for peace. The upkeep of the church and museum is extremely costly, but is supported by a group of expert volunteers, much like a medieval masons guild. As well as direct support, they raise money by making and selling weather vanes and souvenirs of various kinds. Their main workshop is in the Deanery, which was built in 1440 right on the town's wall. From the castle, the fortifications fanned out and surrounded the town, which was built around the foot of the hill. Parts of the wall still remain, but as usual in towns of this kind, by the 19th century it had become superfluous and, with the advent of the motor car, a barrier. There were 3 main gates and 2 smaller gates. Most of them were later torn down, except for this one. The cottage nearby was the home of the gatekeeper. The Avstedt Gate was added in 1484 to give access to water in the case of fire. It's also known as the Tanner's Gate, but this wasn't nearly enough to save the town in 1635 when, during the 30 Years' War, almost the whole town burned down. This was an administrative building for a nearby monastery, and the ground floor is dated 1484. Built of stone, it survived the fire, but the upper timber-framed stories did not and had to be rebuilt. The marks in most of the beams show that at one time the facade was plastered over. Smooth beams are those that were replaced after the plaster was removed. Many of the houses in Herrenberg's historic centre are still rendered in plaster, but a lot of work is being put into renovation despite all the challenges. Modern safety standards clash with regulations for landmark preservation, and both clash with the demands of building in an official earthquake zone. But perhaps the locals are driven by the Swabian work ethic. Work, work, build a little house. The old granary is in the middle of its restoration. It was a tithe barn to store the grain that was to go to the lords of the manor as a kind of tax. Right next to the Tübingen Gate, it has an observation bay that formed part of the town's defences. The marketplace was the focus of the political and economic life of the community. The town hall is the newest building here, dating from 1806 and bearing the town's coat of arms, which was taken from the old Nüfringen Gate. It's the same as the coat of arms for Tübingen, but with the colours reversed. The fountain includes the ducal arms of Württemberg. An earlier version of this fountain was apparently brightly coloured and gilded. It was common for towns to show off by having richly decorated market fountains. This is where the most powerful, influential and wealthy citizens lived, and it's here that we find a familiar monogram. In the 1650s, Hans Jakob Kernler built this house and started his business empire. In 1664, he built the house next to it as a shop. He then acquired 2 more plots of land in adjacent streets, and at this point, his son Johann Jakob took over the family business and made it even more successful. Finally, his son, also called Johann Jakob, built a second shop, but he died without an heir, and his widow and her new husband invested their wealth in charitable organizations. At one time, almost the entire southern side of the marketplace belonged to the Kernler family. One feature of the old town is the flights of steps that serve as useful shortcuts. This flight, no longer in use, shows the wear and tear of generations of townsfolk. At some point the steps were turned over instead of being replaced, and since then the mortar has been eroded away. Herrenberg is at the western end of the Schönbuch, Baden-Württemberg's oldest nature park, a kind of green oasis in the otherwise quite densely populated area south of Stuttgart. It's about 25 kilometers from east to west and 10 kilometers north to south. About 3 kilometers from Herrenberg is the 35-meter-high Schönbuch Tower on the park's second highest point, the Stellberg. As incredible as it seems now, there were once plans to build Stuttgart's airport in the Schönbuch. Herrenberg is busy doing all it can to promote itself as the ideal place for tourists, artists and industry. Not everything has run smoothly. The town council provided window boxes for the houses on the marketplace, but found residents weren't always good at looking after them, and so the council has had to take on that responsibility rather than let the flowers wilt. Outside of the historic centre, the town is hoping to modernise and attract new businesses and new residents. Easily within commuting distance of the notoriously polluted city of Stuttgart, it looks as if it might do well. I'd like to say a very big thank you to the staff at the Dean's Office and the Museum of Bells for their help in the making of this video. Herrenberg is a small town situated just south of Stuttgart. It is a stop on the intercity line from Stuttgart to Singen, but there are also very frequent commuter trains. It takes about 40 minutes from Stuttgart Central Station by S-Bahn. It's the last stop on line S1, or you can take an RE train, which is slightly faster. You can also take an S-Bahn train from Stuttgart Airport with one transfer at Rohr, and again the whole journey takes about 40 minutes. If you prefer to drive, Herrenberg is on the A81 Autobahn, but be aware that the town is a low emission zone, so you will need to make sure that your car is compliant. Or you could just park somewhere out of town and walk. If you're in a wheelchair, Herrenberg is definitely doable, just not easy. The steps, which are a feature of the town, are convenient for the able-bodied, but there are step-free routes as well. They're just a bit longer. I stayed at Kirchgasse 1, which is a small family-run guest house in the very centre of Herrenberg, overlooking the marketplace. Now, it is a 17th century townhouse, so some of the rooms are a little bit quirky and not at all built with wheelchair accessibility in mind. Because it is in the centre, which is mostly pedestrianised, parking is very restricted, but you can get there by following these signs. From the train station you can of course take a taxi, or it's a 10 to 15 minute walk if you don't have too much luggage. It's very easy to find. If you can see the church, just walk towards it. For obvious reasons, the Museum of Bells is not wheelchair accessible. It's open for a few hours on Wednesdays, Saturdays, Sundays and public holidays, and in addition there is a carillon concert every month. For the Schönbuch Tower, I took bus 782, which runs every half hour, to the last stop, and from there I walked back to Herrenberg so that it was downhill most of the way. Most tourists who visit here are day trippers, but if you do feel like staying longer, there are a few interesting places within a 50-kilometer radius. The chocolate factory in Waldenbuch is worth looking into if you have children. Mercedes-Benz has its main factory and a museum in Sindelfingen, and I have it on good authority that there is an excellent roof tile museum in Bad Herrenalb. Also, Hohenzollern Castle is near enough to be seen from Herrenberg on a clear day, but it does have to be a clearer day than when I was there. I would definitely recommend Herrenberg to anybody looking for a picture postcard version of Germany that is not one of the usual tourist traps. It does cater very well for tourists, but has somehow managed to stay unspoiled. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to send me a postcard, here's the address. And don't forget to visit my website and follow me on Twitter and Facebook. Also, if you'd like access to special bonus content and help with the costs of running this channel, please consider making a small monthly donation on Patreon.